Van Jackson is a scholar of international relations, specializing in East Asian and Pacific security, critical analysis of defense issues, and the intersection of working-class interests with foreign policy. He is a senior lecturer in international relations at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, a senior research scholar at Security in Context, where he co-directs the Multipolarity Great Power Competition and the Global South Project, and a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington. Van is the author of 5 books, including Grand Strategies of the Left, The Foreign Policy of Progressive World-Making, The Rivalry Peril, How Great Power Competition Threatens Peace and Weakens Democracy. He has appeared widely in media, including The Majority Report with Sam Sater, HBO's Vice News Tonight, CNN, BBC Radio, and Planet America. His writing has been featured in Foreign Affairs, Dissent, The Nation, Jacobin, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Atlantic, among others. Van also writes the Undiplomatic newsletter and co-hosts Bang Bang, a podcast about war movies from an anti-imperialist perspective. Van, please take it away.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting me. It's very much an honor to be here, in part because Eric Olenwright is somebody whose work was like crucial to my own intellectual formation. So if you open any document about defense strategy or national security strategy, there's one word that you find over and over and over, and that's interest, right? They call it the national interest, the national security interest. Sometimes they'll call it vital interests or core interests. And it's this fuzzy referent object that modern militaries and administrative states have been designed to secure. And what I wanted to kind of talk about today is the irony embedded in that purpose, because the national interest as a concept is a growing source of insecurity in the world, not because of anything intrinsic, but because of how governments rely on and exploit it. So when I've given a version of this talk a couple of times, and I had usually drawn heavily on like foreign policy examples to kind of illustrate and frame things up, to make sense, to particularize the kind of like what could be a very abstract discussion. But there's nothing more sort of like concrete and visceral and of the moment right now than this wave of like new right thinking that is justifying the MAGA ruling class that has taken over. So in June 2022, while the Biden administration was preoccupied with a proxy war fending off Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they were politicking to secure what would become the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, the public mind was very sort of focused on those two objects more than anything else. And while that was happening, there was a group of prominent national conservatives, NatCons, who quietly signed a statement of principles that appeared in the American Conservative, which is a magazine founded by and closely associated with the Pat Buchanan wing of the Republican Party. And this group, which sometimes gets called like post-liberal, they're a who's who of monarchists, fascists, reactionaries, counter-revolutionaries, political appointees from Trump's first presidential term. You know, Michael Anton was like the leading signatory of this. Not only was he from Trump 1.0, but he's right now Trump's director of policy planning at the State Department. So what unites these guys, and I'm sure you recognize some of the names on the slide, what unites them is not just a kind of new right-wing fusionism, but a sense that these guys themselves are a Leninist vanguard of a counter-revolution in the Arno Meyer sense, which is to say they fancy themselves revolutionaries, but of the reactionary kind, right? And they refer to themselves this way. That's not me making like an inference, you know? And they identify themselves as enemies of a liberal elite, specifically, especially a Washington elite, you know? And yet they're not populists, they are counter elites, right? They are a different set of ruling class elites. So when this manifesto was issued, it got very little public attention. You know, what it amounted to, though, was the production of ideology. And it's important to understand that, like, the power coalition, the MAGA movement, the Trump cult of personality, that stuff came first, and the ideology formed in around it, right? And so they are the producers of ideology, a set of assumptions and narratives that justify and make sense of the formation of the political bloc, right? So these NatCons, these national conservatives, were trying to render into coherence a cauldron of ideas that had been bubbling among conservative intellectuals for a little while. And they were trying to do that so that they could position themselves amid the 21st century's dramatic political realignments, not just the sort of withering away of mainstream liberal politicians and their growing irrelevance and unpopularity, but also the rise of Bernie Sanders and the Justice Democrats, which they, of course, see as like a massive threat. And then crucially, the ascendance of Donald Trump to power, which they saw as an opportunity, you know? And so when you actually read their manifesto, and it's not that long, you see that the ideology that they're generating is, in effect, a new old nationalism, right? The keystone idea in the National Conservative Project is veneration of, the nation, quote unquote, and its interests. And it says it right, like this paragraph on the slide is right at the top of the manifesto. We emphasize the idea of the nation because we see a world of independent nations, each pursuing its own national interests and upholding national traditions that are its own as the only genuine alternative to universalist ideologies, blah, 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 right? So if you take their manifesto at face value, they say some things that sound sensible or at least inoffensive. There's an entire paragraph in it where they claim to be anti-imperialist. And that sounds pretty good to me if you don't read any further, but it's these same guys that they're leading proponents of Trump's imperialist foreign policy. They co-sign land grabs of Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal. They're full-throated backers of Israeli war crimes in Gaza and settlements in the West Bank. They believe in dollar primacy and the U.S. centrality to the capitalist world system. They believe the U.S. should hold on to its colonies in Guam, American Samoa, Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and Puerto Rico. And they don't want these places to have self-determination, which, as a sidebar, makes them not so different from the liberal establishment that they repudiate, at least in this respect, right? But my point is that this National Conservative Manifesto is the most coherent, high-minded articulation of the new right's reactionary ideology. And it is full of contradictions, man. They refer to the national interest, as you can see, as if it's this like Harry Potter phrase that has magical powers by saying it, They act like they've invented gold, like as if every politician who's ever lived hasn't draped themselves in the rhetoric of the national interest, So this new right ideology is a highly exaggerated version, a mask-off version of what has been common in foreign policy in the national security state for a long time. Like something has gone very wrong in the politics around this thing we call the national interest, and specifically in the efforts of states to secure it. And so, since this is going to be the governing ideology of our times, as thin as it is, we need to ask some serious questions. Who pays a price for the choices that we make in the name of the national interest? Who actually gets to be secure as a result of national security policies? And more importantly, who and what must be sacrificed because of the abstract ideas that drive our foreign policy, right? So what I'm presenting here today is essentially an imminent critique of this concept that has become the lodestar for all modern geopolitics and foreign policy. But for the national conservatives specifically, it's even the lodestar of domestic politics. This is their organizing construct of their political coalition, right? So this is the argument in brief, right? Although the national interest taken literally is supposed to describe the choices that benefit communities of common fate, I mean, literally the interests of the nation, it has become an elitist idea that justifies and perpetuates immense amounts of suffering in the world. And any nationalism that does not resolve its own contradictions falls into barbarism. It's always been that way. So what I'm arguing ultimately here is that confronting the contradictions in how elites use the national interest as an idea and the erroneous assumptions at the root of how they think about the national interest, confronting those contradictions is the only way to realize the common good to which the idea aspires, which is why they bother using this rhetoric in the first place, right? Because it implies a kind of common good, right? And we have to do what I'm suggesting because our governments are spending obscene levels on securing the national interest. And yet in my lifetime, the world has never felt more insecure. And that's a contradiction. So what I'm going to do here is kind of walk through the architecture of this contradiction and specifically address three different ways that the pursuit of the national interest does harm to peace, democracy, and equality. And those are things that normal people would judge to be very much in the national interest. And the point of this is that if we start from a place of clarity about how the pursuit of the national interest is actually leading to its opposite, we can then unlock more durable forms of security, like dare I say, a better world is like available on the other side of resolving these contradictions. So definitions, right? What are we talking about when we talk about the national interest? It's kind of cliche to point out that like nations are social constructs or imagined communities. It's true, but it's also not super helpful. They are fictions that are territorially bounded, and yet they're also anchored in something real, right? But the important thing is to understand that the nation is the thing that justifies the state. We have a habit, especially in international relations, of speaking of nation states or national states. And there's an immense amount of mystification going on when we do that, and a few scholars have seen this very clearly. So, I mean, there's a bunch of quotes up here, but the one that most stands out for my purposes is Eric Hobsbawm, who insisted that nations do not make states and nationalism, but the other way around. And that is a pretty revealing statement. And I think what's useful about it and these other like similar ways of understanding the national interest is that it gestures toward two entangled assumptions that make the contradictions of the national interest possible. So one assumption is what I call a spatial fix fallacy, or the logic of the spatial fix. And I'm sure many of you have heard geopoliticians make arguments about some country or some particular geography is like the pivotal location, right? He who controls Taiwan controls Asia. He who controls Asia controls the world. Mwah, right? That's like a very common sort of, domino theory is another version of this, right? And the idea of the spatial fix in all of its variations is that security can be bought with military force projected into the quote unquote right geographic space, right? And this is a very seductive way of thinking for a policymaker because it promises a way out of wicked problems. It promises a way out of problems that are like inherently political, right? But that's a false promise most of the time, you know? At best, it's like a near-term thing that has longer-term consequences, right? So as the basis for national security, the spatial fix is an alternative to remedying the pathologies within security thinking. It's a way of avoiding the contradictions that I'm saying we need to confront. And the fallacy of it is that depending on what you mean, there isn't any security in this spatial solutionism. Spatial reasoning is a band-aid on a bullet hole. Not only does it treat as a fixed outcome moments that are actually part of like historical processes, it also confuses a hypothetical advantage or disadvantage in certain worst case scenarios with notions of security or like the interest of the whole of a nation. And those are not the same things. So at best, there's like a lot of conflation of ideas going on here. So that's one assumption. The second assumption that makes contradictions of the national interest possible is the assumption of divisible security. So this is the belief that securing the nation, again, I have to keep using air quotes, can and typically must come at the expense of others. I think it's generally accepted that most governing elites do deploy foreign policy in ways that are zero sum. Certainly, that's like the entirety of U.S. foreign policy right now. And this means that like we think about the world in such a way that my security might need to mean your death or your sacrifice or your exclusion. J.D. Vance has been very explicit about this, right? He says security is a scarce commodity in the world, which means we ought to hoard it at the expense of others. And that's just such a bananas way of thinking about security, But anyway, this idea of security being divisible is something that's actually very, even though it's like prominent on the far right, it's naturalized in most traditions of international relations theory too. Like it's pervasive in security studies and strategic studies, this assumption. And that just ain't right. Like that's not how it is, So one thing I should say is like, it's possible to come up with examples that might seem to validate either of these assumptions, the spatial fix or divisible security, but these assumptions are not always correct, even if you can find outlier cases where it seems like they are. Philosophically, there's a strong case to be made that they ought to be rejected on their face, no justice, no peace. That's a slogan, it's an ethos, but it's also a causal observation, no justice, no peace. And as I said a second ago, if we take our empirical evaluations not as snapshots, but as historical processes, we know that externalizing violence, hierarchy, and exclusion, we know it generates negative feedback, blowback, unintended consequences. It changes who we are to relate to the world in that kind of way, right? From Aimé Césaire to Frantz Fanon, we know that, for example, colonialism transforms not just the colonized, but the colonizer too. And so this should be an obvious point, but it bears stressing the situation that future decision makers face and how they think about what is even possible is going to be shaped by what we do in the present. So the trouble here is not just that these assumptions are partially incorrect or dubious in some sense, although they kind of are. It's also that you can see how these assumptions could lead almost inevitably to a politics of reaction and deflection. Whether these assumptions actually sustain systems of violence or whether these assumptions, help liberate people from oppression depends on other circumstances. But these assumptions are not value neutral. This is lopsided terrain that tends to favor violence and reactionaries, right? And one of the other things Eric Hobsbawm noted was, like it says on the slide, nations exist not only as functions of a particular kind of territorial state or the aspiration to establish one, but also in the context of a particular stage of technological and economic development, right? So what something means depends on where it's situated in time and space, and Stuart Hall made similar observations, and I'm going to return to this point in a minute. But the crucial insight here is that trying to make a better world requires that you understand the balance of political forces and terrains of struggle in your historical conjuncture. And in our historical conjuncture, which is to say, right effing now, the national state with its national interests is part of that landscape, right? And whether that's a good or bad thing, a favorable or unfavorable thing, depends on some other factors. But right now, the national interest and those who wield it is tilting overwhelmingly in favor of the forces of reaction. And so part of what I want to talk about is why that is. So the three, I don't know if I specified already that there are three contradictions in the national interest that I'm highlighting, but there are three. So the first of these is the most obvious contradiction, which is that the national interest insists on unit level approaches to system level problems, right? National frameworks for mobilizing resources and collective action are logically mismatched against global threats, right? The most obvious global threats, the truly existential ones, are of course climate change and pandemics. And national security has not been a remedy to these deep sources of insecurity. It's made them worse, right? So while COVID-19 was spreading around the world, how did national security states in the global north respond? They responded with vaccine apartheid. Disinformation threatened inflation about China, right? The Pentagon waged an actual global campaign during lockdown trying to convince countries in the global south not to accept China's vaccine, even though at the time those countries didn't have access to US vaccines. That's some evil stuff, And then on climate change, the mismatch between planetary problems and national imaginations could not be more stark, man. Nobody thinks the Paris Agreement is going to save us from the climate crisis. Not that it matters since we walk away from it now under Trump, right? But it wasn't going to save us to begin with. And if you add up everything our political leaders and societies have done, from cloth bags at the grocery store to EVs to climate financing, the totality of it is far too little, far too late. Fundamentally, individual units in the international system cannot resolve problems of the system unless they do away with the spatial fix fallacy and the assumption of divisible security. And planetary problems are not even limited to these two existential issues that are in our face with pandemics and climate change, right? The sovereign debt crisis crushing the global south right now is a planetary problem because we exist in a capitalist world system. What's happening in the global south is not apart from that system. It's an intrinsic part of that system. And there's even a way in which we should be rethinking nuclear war as a system level problem, not just because any nuclear war really does affect us all, but because nuclear armed states are locked into interdependent global systems of signaling and mutual fear. The risks to us all that come from that interdependent system of signaling and mutual fear, that has everything to do with nuclear strategists in the respective countries approaching the problem of nuclear war as my flag versus your flag, red versus blue, clashing national interests. So the framework of governments securing the national interest has proven itself incapable of coping with planetary scale problems that are existential for most of us. And you could hardly expect otherwise when we're talking about unit level solutions to system level problems. It's a profound mismatch. So, the second contradiction in the national interest has to do with how the rhetoric of the national interest is used. And what is meant by it in practice, what is done in its name, is often against the interest of the nation as a whole by any normal person's standards. And so, to put it differently, if the national interest is this mystification of state behavior, what is being mystified? What is the mystification obscuring, right? Well, Jeannie Moorfield had this great book, Empires Without Imperialism, and she evaluated Britain in the Edwardian era based on what it did, despite what it said, to show that liberal rhetoric was a deflection from imperial practice. And she kind of like juxtaposed that with an evaluation of neoconservatism around the time of the Iraq invasion. And that, of course, and that this is the point that she makes, that too was liberal rhetoric, imperial practice. And I mention this because we can also view the national interest as a rhetorical deflection. And in fact, we have no grounds for evaluating the national interest apart from what it justifies in practice. So just one example of many, America has launched dozens of military interventions into Latin America the past 150 years, right? Almost all of them have been rationalized, not just on like realpolitik grounds of the national interest, but more specifically in equating the national interest with the exercise of the Monroe Doctrine, right? Repeated unilateral U.S. aggression against other sovereign nations dozens of times. It was based on decisions in Washington that America should have all of Latin America as an exclusive, quote unquote, sphere of interest, their words, and that no outside power should be allowed to have influence there. And this is the context of Trump asserting precisely that over the Panama Canal, right? And so, crucially, everybody's familiar with the Monroe Doctrine to varying degrees. U.S. officials never really saw Europe as a threat to the U.S. since the Monroe Doctrine. They saw Europe as a hypothetical threat to an American imperial sphere. Defending that imperial construct cost blood, cost treasure, but did not actually make America more secure. And the doctrine that justifies this, that we claim is in our national interest, is in practice right now. So I mentioned at the start that the national interest is the ideology of the new Trump administration, or at least it's the ideological rhetoric of the new Trump administration. The substance of it is something different. And we have to ask why that's such a departure from the past. And in most of the ways that matter, it's actually not a departure from the past, which should be the continuities between Trump and everyone else should be disconcerting, right? And so the Biden administration, their national security strategy in 2022, it said, our strategy is rooted in our national interests. And then it went on to refer to U.S. interests 60 times in 48 pages. That's not unusual. The Trump administration 1.0, their national security strategy referred to the U.S. interests 68 times, right? Marco Rubio just gave a speech, not a speech, an interview to Megyn Kelly. In his one sit-down interview, he used the phrase national interest 26 times. Again, that's some Harry Potter shit. Like, what is that deflecting from? That's the question, right? So, what is the strategy? What are our governments doing in fulfillment of these national interests. If you're going to say it 26 times in one interview, what are you referring to by that, right? So the Biden administration, for its part, declared baldly that leading the world, quote unquote, was in the United States' undeniable self-interest, right? It's interest all the way down. That, though, is a declaration of American primacy, which is a strategy of domination that is mismatched with the global distribution of power. Primacy requires what's called unipolarity, an extreme imbalance of power, where there's only one superpower in the world system, right? An extreme concentration of power. And yet the world is rapidly becoming multipolar. And even the national conservative guys are saying this. Marco Rubio was trending the other day for talking about our emergent multipolar world, which is something that the Biden folks resisted acknowledging. But whether it's Biden or Rubio, they're all pursuing primacy, this predatory way of relating to the world, right? So why would primacy be in the national interest, right? Especially considering the high price that such a predatory way of relating to the world demands. And for Biden, his strategy also promised that it would compete. This is one of the reasons primacy is a peril, because it requires you to compete with, quote unquote, those powers that offer a darker vision and thwarting their efforts to threaten our interests. Okay, this is like Biden's rhetorical framework for justifying all that they did. You know, they did a lot of bad stuff. So it's just like with the Monroe Doctrine here, though. Threaten our interests. Europe didn't threaten America. It threatened America's exclusive sphere of influence, potentially, hypothetically. China today doesn't threaten America. It threatens American primacy. So Arnold Wolfers called this like milieu goals, right? You're talking about national security, you're talking about national interests, but what you're really talking about are milieu goals, something short of survival, you know, and you're conflating it with your survival. So in the US case, and in most cases, what's really going on when we talk about the national interest is that our governments are wielding that rhetoric to insist that the immense resources allocated to the national security state are tethered to reason. And those reasons are grounded in the spatial fix assumption and the assumption of divisible security. And those assumptions are not even questioned. They're seemingly unquestionable. And what states do in the name of interests reveals the real priorities of the state. This is why it was so important that Jeannie Moorfield was contrasting the liberal rhetoric of Edwardian empire with the imperial practice of Edwardian empire. What you do reveals your real priorities, right? So when government officials and security scholars and pundits invoke the national interest, what they're doing is justifying the accumulation or expansion or use of state power. And it is absolutely this way now. It's basically this way now everywhere, but it hasn't necessarily always been that way. In a previous historical conjuncture around World War II and in the aftermath of World War II, the national interest was not always functioning in a violent, reactionary, secretive way for some of the newly independent states, you know, former colonies asserting self-determination, which is obviously a national interest. That was part of national liberation, you know, but that ain't where we live anymore. In this conjuncture that we're living in now, those assumptions of the spatial fix and divisible security, they're manifesting in very dark ways, right? Where the national interest becomes a deflection from militarism and poor, fuzzy judgment. Something like this also happened to the third worldists, you know. Franz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth by Fanon, that's like the most famous anti-colonial text of all time. And people think about it in terms of like justifying violence or whatever. But in the middle of that book, he's got 150 pages basically just going hard in the paint on nationalist bourgeoisie. Like, this guy was critically obsessed with the nationalist bourgeoisie who represented a co-optation of national liberation. He specifically said the use of the national interest by these bourgeoisie made the national interest not about liberation, but about dictatorship and single party rule. And then the question then, as now, is why? Why is the national interest functioning habitually not on behalf of human liberation, but on behalf of militarism? You know, well, one of the quirks of history that gives rise to our current moment is what some would call our imperial mode of living. Rich nations, in particular the US, have found a way to create distance between the conduct of war and the consequences of war. And that is a ruptural difference with the past. Like, it's always been the case that from the perspective of the poor or from the perspective of the economically insecure, war is what Eric Hobsbawm called the disruption and destruction of the order of life and labor. So if you think like a century ago, military buildups and what were literally called world wars, they required a mass mobilization that actively disrupted, for the worse, the everyday lives of everyday people, right? The involuntary self-sacrifice that war used to demand of us had a built-in restraint mechanism checking the forces of militarism. Hobsbawm, as it says on the slide, explained that the desire to return to a decent, orderly life implied hostility to war, to military service, to the war economy, etc., and the wish for peace. So that's not the world we live in now. Something changed during the Cold War, right? When the US was attacked on 9/11, George Bush was asked what Americans should do now that it was launching a global war on terror. And he, of course, said, go shopping. And it's like, what? So there's this American Marine, Miles Lugosi. He was a combat cameraman in Afghanistan, and he made this famous documentary in 2018 called Combat Obscura, right? And it's kind of like gonzo journalism about the war on terror from the inside and how it was failing. Anyways, he said in an interview around the time of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, he said, there's no graceful way to lose a war, but I feel like the thing that most Americans were upset about was the optics and how it looked, because no one gave a shit about the war for 20 years. It's the longest war in American history, and nobody cared about it until we pulled out. No one gave a shit about the war for 20 years. It's the longest war in American history. If you were in America anytime in the last 20 years, and we all have been, you look around and you see nothing to do with war that's absent from your everyday life, visibly, right? But through a combination of technology and technocracy and tax dollars and underwritten by a spatial fixed fallacy and an assumption of divisible security, the US national security state over the past 70 years, 60 years, has fashioned a way to do as much war as it thinks is necessary while most of the country lives in ignorance about it. Do you even know that we're at war in Yemen and Syria? Like, does anyone even talk about this? Like, the once built-in restraint mechanism checking the forces of militarism have been broken in our present moment. So in every American war since World War II, especially in the stupid ones, it's never those directly responsible for mass casualty violence who are censored, who are silenced, who are sent to jail. Policy officials live in a culture of impunity and self-policing, and I know because I was one. And if you think that's an overstatement of the case, consider the invasion of Vietnam, the illegal bombings of Cambodia and Laos, from the illegal invasion of Iraq to the illegal global war on terror. These are cases that everyone laments now if you have half a brain, half a heart, but politicians and policymakers have never been held to account for these things. And if you spoke out against them at the time, you were censored, right? So we have these repeated bloody blunders as constituting what we do in practice, what we do in the name of the national interests. And they are not in the interests of any nation as a whole. And that brings me to the third contradiction of the national interest, which centers on the question of who benefits and who is harmed by what we do. So the contradiction here is that the distribution of gain and pain when states attempt to secure the national interest is rarely to the benefit of all. It's never evenly distributed, and it's almost always forcing the majority to sacrifice while a few benefit concretely. And this highlights a profound universal problem with how states try to secure the national interest today in our current conjuncture. So I have a quote here from Tariq Barkawi, and he's calling out a core pathology that runs right through the heart of strategic theory. Like, we cannot choose, our governments cannot choose the rational path, almost by definition, without a full sense of the costs and benefits of our actions. We can never honestly answer the question of whether the game is worth the candle if we can't grasp the magnitude of sacrifices that the game requires. Rationality is the sacred premise in strategizing for the national interest. And yet rationality demands that we pay full attention, careful attention to every kind of cost generated by the actions. And we're not doing that. We're seeing the terrain of strategy in a way that obscures the actual distribution of not just death and destruction, but also profit and protection. And that is literally pathological, right? And there's the larger problem with this is that it's counter even to self-interest. Like, if we're not sensitive to those who bear the chief burden of our relative security, then we will inevitably generate blowback, unintended consequences, right? What everyone from Edmund Burke to Michel Foucault recognized as the imperial boomerang effect, right? Wars never just happen out there, but the national interest, because of the assumptions underpinning it, makes us believe that war can be a thing that merely happens out there. It makes us believe that we can do global wars on terror and it won't create politicians like Trump, which in fact is precisely what happened, according to my friend Spencer Ackerman's award-winning book. The global war on terror was the condition of possibility for Trump to emerge as a president. So what is to be done? One school of thought is to change the words that governing elites use. And I'm not the first person to recognize that the national interest is a fuzzy phrase. Some people have argued very reasonably that we get rid of the language of quote unquote national interest, don't allow that even to be a referent in our documents and stuff, precisely because it's fuzzy, right? They would advocate turning strategy into like a problem solving statement. Okay, sensible. Another school of thought says that like we need to look beyond the state itself. Planetary politics is the way, abolition of the nation state. There's that as a horizon, sure, there's a logic to that insofar as the modern state system is burdened by war-prone pathologies. And the reality is that national states are badly mismatched with planetary security problems. But how realistic is that, right? These two suggestions, they're just not enough. Like if we're still thinking our way into spatial fixes and divisible security arrangements, even if we do these suggestions, then we are still going to end up reproducing or redirecting the symptoms of insecurity plaguing us today. So we have to face the contradictions. Any people, I'm not suggesting we romanticize the nation, but any people that share a common territorial space are going to have common interests. Yes, those interests are probably quite thin. No, those interests are probably insufficient to justify power hoarding on the part of national security states. But those interests could be called national interests. How then do we face the contradictions? Well, there are a bunch of foreign policy examples I could talk through if we had more time, but circling back to like the national conservatism thing real quick is useful. So that's my man Stuart Hall up on the slide. Darren Beatty just got announced as Trump's nominee for Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. He's also a white nationalist who said in October 2024, what it says on the slide here, right? Competent white men must be in charge if you want things to work. Unfortunately, our entire national ideology is predicated on coddling the feelings of women and minorities and demoralizing competent white men. Like, what a dick, But like, I'm not picking on this guy personally. He deserves it though. But like, he is representative of something on the new right, the far right. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, Steve Bannon, all these guys have expressed a nationalism that is indistinguishable from white supremacy. And a white, by definition, divisible nationalism is what's driving us down the path of immigration raids and border hysteria and giving Russia and Israel a pass, but giving Iran and China and Mexico and Palestine death, right? That's white nationalist foreign policy, bro. Highly exclusionary, highly predatory, which is to say highly divisible, right? Trump's embrace of freaking Lebensraum. He said, we need Greenland for living space and also to do World War III with China, to confront China, right? That's a little too perfect of a spatial fix, right? And what's crazy is that all of this stuff, individually or as a totality, this is not stuff that serves the interests of white folks. This serves the interests of some white folks, right? But more importantly, this racialized national interest is at odds with the formal ideology of these folks, right? Formally, they still disavow white nationalism. The 2022 manifesto from the beginning, it explicitly says we condemn the use of state and private institutions to discriminate and divide us against one another on the basis of race. The nationalism we espouse respects and indeed combines the unique needs of particular minority communities and the common good of the nation as a whole. It's like words don't even matter anymore. Up is down. So we should not be under any illusions here. Pointing out the contradictions to our enemies is not going to change their minds. But refusing to accept their narratives limits their legitimacy. Exposing hypocrisy exposes barbarism. And when a ruling class is revealed to be nakedly evil or purely might makes right, then mass mobilization becomes easier. Winning over converts becomes at least possible, right? And treating the contradictions as a site for agitation, which is what Stuart Hall urged us to do, gives us not just a kind of moral clarity, but the moral high ground in our demands for change. So addressing the contradictions inherent to what we do in the name of the national interest, it can get us closer to human liberation. And I think that's why we should care about building knowledge in the first place, right? To get us closer to human liberation. And whatever you think of it, the idea of the national interest is so entrenched in our current historical conjuncture that like it might be a waste of time trying to dislodge it when we can weaponize it. Like I said, Marco Rubio 3 days ago gave an interview. He used the national interest 26 times. And yet every policy idea that came out of his mouth perpetuated the assumptions of divisible security and the spatial fix fallacy that condemn us all to World War III. And when most of us get killed, they're going to say it was in the national interest. All right. So it's up to anyone who's in the policy or international relations spaces to do analysis differently, to think about national security and the national interest differently, to not succumb to like methodological nationalism, most of all, right? And for all of us, whether we do policy stuff or not, to recognize that when Marco Rubio talking out the side of his face, it ain't nothing but mystification of the expansion of state power on behalf of sectional, not national interests. So a more durable security is available within our conjuncture, within a system of national states even, that pursue the interests of their nations even, but only if we challenge these spatial fix assumptions and these assumptions about divisible security, right? I lost track of time. I might have gone over, sorry. But that's the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, Van. First of all, thanks for a really great talk. That was fascinating and also very entertaining. So thank you very much. So I've got two questions. The first one relates to the potential contradiction between two things that are going on. That is to say that there is increased polarization taking place in a lot of countries in the global north right now, which are, if anything, sort of, and it seems to be the right that are driving it, which is, if anything, driving national defragmentation, and yet the national interest is still constantly evoked. So to some extent, these sort of things are in contradiction. I'm just wondering if you think that how that plays out, if you like, what the effect of growing polarization in so many societies in the global north, how that impacts the ability of elites to call upon the national interest to evoke it as something serious. So that's the first question. The second question is about articulations of the national interest in the nation from the left rather than from the right, because you primarily spoke about, I think, the national interest from the perspective of powerful nations in the global north. And you mentioned towards the end, societies in the global south and so on, but you sort of talked about the era of anti-colonial nationalisms being over and that nationalism primarily, fundamentally takes on a different character now. My question would be, though, that does it not change your argument in any way if you consider the national interest from the perspective of various nations in the global south who, for example, might evoke the national interest in terms of the protection of natural resources from neoliberal multinationals, or the way in which, say, for example, in the Arab revolutions, the nation as a category was constantly evoked. People were sort of saying, we are the nation, and implicitly making an argument about what the national interest is there. Or in Palestine today, similar sets of arguments could be raised. Or even in Europe, I think that to sort of adapt the argument of Wolfgang Streeck, he would sort of say that, transnational institutions like the EU, like neoliberal institutions, are fundamentally damaging democracy. Ordinary people don't have any mechanisms of democratic accountability over internationalists, but we do have it at the level of the nation. And therefore, in order to challenge neoliberal globalization, we actually might have to deglobalize politics, which would imply a renationalization of politics, which again evokes national interest as a mean, as a sort of articulated to a set of arguments on the left. So I'm just interested, how does that change the argument that you're making in any way at all? Thanks very much.
Yeah, those are very smart questions. So on the first one, everybody, I think the only political force that sometimes resists draping themselves in the national interest is the left. Right. And I think it would be a mistake. Part of what's generating this is I think it's a mistake to try and resist the terrain of struggle itself, but rather you need to exploit the terrain of struggle. And what I see is the national interest and the idea of nations as built into our terrain of struggle. So you don't challenge the premise of the scenario, you work the scenario to your maximum advantage, right? And so I think it's a losing effort, it's Sisyphean, it's an inefficient allocation of whatever power we have on the left. to try and focus it on like delegitimizing the nation as a site, or the national interest as a site. But there are still huge problems there, and it's not a neutral terrain. And so I'm trying to sort of reconcile with both of those things. I think left, right, and center, even especially under polarized conditions, the national interest is something that everybody is going to claim. There's just on the left, we've been debating the national question for 100-something years. Like that's something that we ought not reject. We ought to be in that fight. Defining the national interest in universal terms or global terms, right? But on the second question, the Global South thing, this was super important. So like our shorthand Wikipedia memory about anti-colonialism, post-colonialism, and the independence of the third world is that it was a bunch of struggles for national liberation understood in the terms that we would think of those words now: national liberation, liberation of a nation state, right? That's not really what it was. And there's a bunch of research that's like the new wave of like third worldist history that's been coming out lately, is that these struggles for national liberation were not actually like nationalist movements the way that we've been sort of conditioned to think of them now. They always had global visions, right? It was always using national liberation as a bulwark or a step in a process as part of realizing human liberation and recognizing that a nation was part of a global fabric. And all of the like the world making after empire stuff, like Adam Getachew, like all the intellectuals justifying third worldism were not trying to defend an exclusionary nationalism. What happened is that dictators and despots and, jingos and nationalist bourgeoisie, the Frantz Fanon obsession, they redirected what it meant, national liberation, to be these exclusionary things that actually masked class conflict within their countries, So like Fanon's beef was always like, you're substituting one ruling class for another, but actually, if you're the poor guy in the field, nothing's changed here, So like, that's damning of what the national interest actually was in practice. So I think, I forget where I was going with that, but it's just the idea that like the national interest in the global South wasn't this horizon of the possible. It was at best a step toward a more global internationalist vision.
Thank you for that. There's a few questions now in the chat that I'll read, Van. One of which, this first one, is somewhat a direct supplementary question to what you were just discussing, which is from Lynn Jones. She asks, any examples from history where challenges to the distorted sense of the national interest were successful? I'm going to read two more, so that's the first question. Justin Lee writes, has not a quote-unquote national interest been used by elites to justify their status and power since before the rise of nation states? Don't American elites understand continued domination of domestic politics depends on the ability to sustain the extractive and exploitative capacities of U.S. empire? Is this not partly why political economy of war has been disassociated with democratic processes? To realign, is it not necessary to establish political and economic democracy throughout the global system? So I'll leave it there for you to come back.
Yeah. So in the first question, history when challenges to the distorted sense of the national interest were successful. I mean, one version of that could be like the early Algerian independence movement against France, right? Like you could say that was a like prototypical assertion of national liberation, and it clearly succeeded. They broke free and kicked out the Pied Noir, but it was also a massive failure or tragedy if you look at what happened to Algeria, right? And so it's like you cannot simply live. This is the problem. Like Algeria is the classic case of why you cannot let the national interest be your horizon. You have to have a vision, and the national interest can be part of that, or maybe like a defensive bulwark, like in the case of, if you're Palestinian in Gaza, you would love some exclusionary security on your behalf, right about now. But it's like, if you only dwell in that and you don't try to go any further, you fall into civil war. You fall into one-party dictatorships, and it's because of these core assumptions and how the national interest is being misrepresented. This spatial fix and divisible security, that those ways of thinking hardwire you for tragedy, for failure, Second question is quite long here. Let me see. Yeah. So this is Emmanuel Wallerstein and Eric Hobsbawm have both made this point kind of more eloquently than I did in the presentation, but ruling class elites justify power hoarding, justify existing distributions of power basically in society through reference to the nation and the national interests. This did predate the 1870s, which is when nationalism took off as an ideology, right? But once nationalism took off as an ideology, it's like on steroids, and that's why like you didn't see national interest reference being so commonplace as they are now. Now it's literally the lodestar. It's like it is what it's what substitutes for actual ideas, and that's what we're seeing with like the MAGA NatCon folks. But like it's totally justifying expansions of effectively the national security state. And that's what it remains under Trump. That's totally what it was under Biden. We have I mentioned this in the lecture, like we have an imperial mode of living, has global consequences that are negative for most folks in the world, but it does benefit some. And we rationalize it in terms of the national interest, CHIPS and Science Act, Inflation Reduction Act. There's some good things in that, but what those things mostly was throwing money at capital, not disciplining capital. And then we called it national interest, but who benefits from it? Poor people don't benefit from that stuff. Corporations benefit from it more than anybody. If you can afford to put solar panels on your house, if you can afford a house, or if you can afford solar panels, you get a tax credit. But like, that's it. And we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, So, yeah, this is what the way forward is to pay attention to like who benefits and who is harmed. This like the specificity and trying to like demystify what's actually going on and what's happening when we use this kind of rhetoric, and we just have to be even more attentive to that than usual in an era where the national interest is like the framework of justifying everything.
Harriet writes, on language, you used racialized capitalism in your presentation. Another common phrase is the ethno-national state. She asks, or she points out that the second looms large around Israel-Palestine, and there's this is also important in domestic politics almost everywhere. Can you elaborate further on these concepts and how they are used?
Yeah, I mean, racial capitalism. So Stuart Hall said that race is the mode or the modality that in which class is experienced. But he also said the opposite. Like later in his life, he said class is the modality in which race is experienced, which is to say that like in practice, these things kind of go together, but maybe for the purposes of analysis, we might prioritize like one over the other, one is primary or something like that. And it's just important to recognize that there are modes of living that make these things kind of intertwined. The ethno-national states thing is very specifically about the sectional interests that are either being appealed to or that are trying to benefit from the policies of the state. So the Trump administration has this kind of imperial foreign policy construct, right? And it has control of a national security state that it's now deploying against the border, against Mexico, against immigrants within the country, Those actions are all being undertaken as part of like a Steve Bannon image of the kind of state that they want to create. They refer to it just as nation, but it's in fact an ethno-nation. You know, it's not fashionable for them to walk around saying ethno-nationalism, but analytically, that's what it is. It's white ethno-nationalism, but it's ethno-nationalism, you know? But part of the reason it's important to identify that is because you can then say, hey, this is screwing everybody who's not part of the in group, but also by their own standards, everybody in their in group, rhetorically at least, the whites, are not benefiting from this stuff. You know, if you're a poor white guy, what are you getting out of all this? Freaking nothing, you know? So you can start to agitate and like appeal to people's grievances, you know, with reality, with an analysis that says like, hey, this is what they're selling you, and it ain't living up to the promise.
Randy has asked, and in your view as a former analyst yourself within the security state, could we move away from national power to human well-being as a metric of success, whereby cooperation across boundaries is something that is held in high esteem rather than expropriation and extraction? Do you think that that's even a remote possibility?
I mean, it's definitely what I would advocate for. I don't know. It's like, I don't see Pete Hegseth doing that at the Pentagon anytime soon. You know, Marco Rubio is not going to change how he understands the national interest to be about human well-being. But that is what it ought to be, you know? So I think like one of the problems that we all kind of face is these guys are talking about the nation and the national interest and like taking care of us, but what the subtext of us is super fuzzy and narrow, and it almost certainly doesn't include you or me, you know? And if it does, we're not benefiting from it. So what the hell? I mean, you know, and like people have like a right to righteous indignation about that. Like all this stuff is not logical. It's not fair. It perpetuates tons of harm. But even on its own terms, it's like, who are you delivering this for? You're delivering this for like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon and Google, and who else, you know? So it would be great if we focused on the well-being of humans. There's a sub program within international relations in security studies that focuses on human security, which is to think about security in a implicitly demilitarized sense, because the object is human beings. So if like the human being is not secure, then something is wrong in the construct, you know? But that's not the mainstream. So, I mean, yeah.
Another question from Harriet, back to Israel-Palestine. How important is U.S. domestic politics? And in Europe and the Middle East, how does international relations inflect national and even more transnational politics?
Those are big questions. A lot. So, you know, on Israel-Palestine, we have AIPAC. It's this lobbying / propaganda arm of the Israeli government that profoundly shapes American politics. You know, they've literally spent hundreds of millions of dollars going after Justice Democrats, which is like the social democratic contingent within the Democratic Party. They've managed to unseat 2 of these members, right? And it's because these social democratic members of the Democratic Party are the most vocal advocates for peace and against militarism and for human rights. And so our security, the way we relate to the world, has us taking Israel's side, arming Israeli war crimes, being unapologetic about it. And then in so doing that, we're actually empowering that client state to then mess in our own politics, to make us more reactionary, to make us less progressive, less egalitarian, and to literally make us less peaceful by using their money and influence to unseat our peace advocates. And then people look at America and they're like, well, maybe America's just really right wing. Maybe America's just really conservative. Are you kidding me? These guys are lobbying to make us that way. And they ain't American. They ain't from here. They ain't of us. They're coming in from the outside because they benefit from our war machine. And they have their own far right project that they're pursuing, On the question of like international relations shaping domestic politics, I didn't mention this, but it's worth mentioning that Hungary, it's an authoritarian regime sitting within Europe. It's a NATO member, which means that it's a beneficiary of our security guarantees and our nukes. And they've been going hard in the paint, oppressing women, LGBT folks, right? It's this white Western traditionalist. It's basically fascism, right? So they are the like intellectual and spiritual beacon of the national conservatives. There's like Hungary is where they held multiple national conservatism conferences the last few years. It's like totally there's a playbook that Viktor Orban in Hungary has implemented that is being implemented in America now. That's what Project 2025 was. It's being implemented, right? Project 2025 was not weird. It was a counter-revolutionary playbook as implemented by Viktor Orban et al., right? And the international is totally bound up with the domestic, and not in a good way so far. So
With our remaining time left, I'm going to ask you perhaps a lighter question, or at least the analysis might be lighter. So given that you are, in fact, a podcaster that takes up movies, ones that explore wars in the military, I'm curious if what 3 films you might recommend to our audience that might help them understand the moment, the conjuncture we're currently living in now, or that might in fact, provide some really great illustrative examples of the kind of arguments you're making here today?
Man, that's a wonderful question. So I think the Battle of Algiers, which I covered on one of my podcasts, that is a true like learning experience. I actually learned a lot from it, but also it's a historical object, like it's a historical and cultural object itself. Like it's been a obsession for like the IRA, the PLO, all kinds of freedom fighter groups, terrorist groups, good guys, bad guys, right? And like everybody has looked to the Battle of Algiers as a kind of not just entertainment or a snapshot of history, but like almost kind of a field manual, for how to either do insurgency or to do counterinsurgency. The Pentagon also loves the Battle of Algiers because they did a screening of it once the Iraq War popped off in 2003. So like Special Forces, Special Operations Command did, because they're like, there's a lot that we can learn from here about, implicitly the folly of what we're getting into, like we're going to end up being like the French. And that's not wrong. So like Battle of Algiers, totally recommend. Ironically, the movie In the Loop, which we've also covered on the podcast, it's a British comedy satire. It's basically like HBO's Veep, but of a movie, and it's satirizing the run up to the Iraq War. But it's hilarious, but it's so true to what I know of how Washington actually works, or like more precisely doesn't work. And it lifts the veil of romance on power. And it's like, oh, these are all just a bunch of opportunists clinging to whatever happens to be conventional wisdom and trying to like look out for themselves. And then what we get as policy choices are just the byproducts of all of that politicking, which is sick. But that's kind of like how power works in just my own time in the system. And then Zero Dark 30 is probably another good one. Because it's showing in a kind of gruesome way, in a celebratory way, the sort of the torture and the murder that we did on the way to getting Osama bin Laden. The film sort of justifies all of that, but the film also ends on this really somber note that suggests not only did we achieve nothing here, but like we've kind of condemned ourselves. We've doomed ourselves. There's nothing left. We got bin Laden. Now what? Okay, now we're going to do it to China. I mean, like what? This just doesn't stop. We are in the loop in a sense. Like this just keeps happening. And it's because we decide to relate to the world in a certain type of way. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to sort of glean from those three films.